an additional power is given, or gift, so to speak, to this being who has completed his journey and arrived at the final destination. And this gift is that he is able to see his master, or the imam, at any given time, in any given place. He is able to have access to him. He is no longer veiled from the imam. Nothing separates him from the imam. Not a tall mountain, not a gigantic sea, not a field or a hill or a house or anything. He can witness and have access to and speak to his master, the imam, at any given time. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد الأئمة المهديين وسلم تسليما. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. My dear brother and companion Ali Rizza.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, اباصادق.
Thank you for joining me.
It's an honor to be here.
The honor's all mine. God bless you. So today we want to talk about the topic which we have been engaged in for the previous or the past 4 episodes, and that is this journey of the believer as he gets closer and closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we spoke about how there's this mystery religion within a religion. We've spoke about how there are specific degrees that a person must cross through. These degrees which we spoke about are not hypothetical, theoretical degrees. There is real evidence of their existence, and it's been not only alluded to, but explicitly stated in books such as Al-Haft al-Sharif, whereby there are a couple doors that speak specifically about the journey of a believer upwards and the journey of the disbeliever downwards, and how there are stations in each of these paths. So there's a good path and there's a bad path. There's the path of the right hand and there's the path of the left hand. And each and every one of them leads towards a station at the very end. In regards to the path of the right hand, it's said that the final destination is mentioned in the Quran in the verse where it says, "And to your Lord is the final destination," or "And to your Lord is the final goal." And so the final station is the throne of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is becoming a caliph of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is a station whereby the believer who's walked down that path has come to fully know God, and he's elevated in degrees, elevated in rank, elevated in station. He has become full in his knowledge and knowing of the Almighty and his embodiment of the characteristics of good, that he has become complete. And Al-Haft al-Sharif goes on to state that he also becomes free, that the chains that are on the rest of the servants fall off of him, and he goes away out of the category of being an abd, or a servant, to being a person who is free, right? And it states that he no longer needs, for example, food and drink. He has reached a state of enlightenment that he has full control over the necessity to have this intake of food and drink. And it mentioned also in Al-Haft al-Sharif how there will be these certain individuals. And by the way, you have stories like this also that exist in Jewish sources, right? And Christian sources where there will be, for example, Abraham, and he will be visited by a group of people, or there will be other believers who are visited by a group of people. And these individuals will come to them, appear to them, they will sit in their home, they will be offered food. The food, for example, would disappear from the plate, and then the host would assume that the individual is eating from it, and then they'll take a second look and the food comes back into its place, and they'll realize that they actually have no need for food or have no need for drink, and that is just an illusion, and that this person is somebody who is of a higher rank or a higher degree. Another one of those things that the believer achieves at the end of the line that's mentioned in al-Hafta Sharif is that this individual who reaches the final destination is able to rise up to the heavens and come back down to the earth at will. So this person has access to the kingdoms of the heaven. He's able to, at any given moment that he wishes, to rise up and go, for example, on a night journey. He can project his soul. He can go on these astral projections. In one of the books, the Bhagavad Gita, they have this section in there which talks about how the ascended master can project himself to different planets by shooting his soul off, and they have this beautiful painting of this man in meditation, and his soul or his consciousness is being projected to a different region or a different place, even though his physical body is there. He's able to see in the malakut like Balaam ibn Ba'ura did, or so many of the other enlightened individuals. And so you have the believer at the very end being able to go on these night journeys that are similar to what the Prophet Muhammad did on his lifetime. And remember, the night journey, the Prophet was laying in his bed, and he looks up and the ceiling opens up, and the heavens open up, the sky opens up, and a creature appears, and he's able to board on this creature, and he goes up into the heavens where he meets all of the enlightened beings who had come to the earth before, such as the Prophet Moses, the Prophet Jesus, all of the different prophets and messengers and saints, and he manages to speak with them, engage with them in conversations. He speaks with the angels, and the angels greet him, right? And he leads them in prayers until in the end he passes beyond a point where any angel or living being has ever been before. And he stands in front of the veil of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? He stands at the throne, and he's able to pierce through the veil and look into the light of God, and he's able to hear the instructions of God and have conversations with him. And so the believer who becomes enlightened, he too reaches a station where he has totally defeated his physical human needs, right? The very nature of this being, even though he's still in a body, he has gained full control over it. The spirit has completely shone through, and now it has control over every aspect of the physical suit that he is wearing. So he's not just in control, for example, of his temper, or in control of his tongue, or in control of his actions. He's in control of the human suit to the point that it doesn't need anymore anything to feed on except for the power that's given to it by the soul itself. The Hafta Sharif continues, and it proclaims that an additional power is given, or gift, so to speak, to this being who has completed his journey and arrived at the final destination. And this gift is that he is able to see his master or the imam at any given time, in any given place. He is able to have access to him. He is no longer veiled from the imam. Nothing separates him from the imam. Not a tall mountain, not a gigantic sea, not a field or a hill or a house or anything. He can witness and have access to and speak to his master, the imam, at any given time. And so this represents a sort of opening that takes place between the believer and between the imam, whereby he's given 24-hour access to the imam. And we know that there are other narrations from the Ahl Bayt alayhim salam that described incidents or individuals who had reached similar ranks or stations with the imam. There are narrations that describe how Malik al-Ashtar, for example, had reached to such a degree that if Imam Ali alayhi salam was far away from him, he could still hear Imam Ali's weeping from a distance, right? Or his speaking from a distance. And so he had access to the Imam. The boundaries, right, or the limitations of the physical ear or the human body was no longer there. His soul broke through, and now he had access to his imam. And this is extremely important because a person who has constant access to their imam, they would reach a certain degree or level or rank of infallibility, because you can't make mistakes anymore if you always have somebody that would give you the right answer, and if you're always constantly reminded of the presence of the imam. And that's really interesting, because you find in other narrations, for example, one of the companions of Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, in one tradition, Imam Sadiq reveals to this individual a secret, and he enlightens him, and he wipes over his face. And then the companion goes forward, and in every direction that the companion looks, he finds Imam Sadiq. He looks to the right, he sees Imam Sadiq alayhi salam is standing there at a distance watching him. He looks up into the sky, and he sees Imam Sadiq alayhi salam is up in the heavens above looking down on him, right? Similar to that painting where you have Arjuna is sitting there after seeing the true form of Krishna, and you see Krishna with 1,000 faces in the sky looking down on Arjuna. The companion is shocked. He begins to run. He jumps into the water, falls down, almost drowns in the sea. He looks in the waters, and what does he find? He finds Imam Sadiq alayhi salam in the sea, also looking back at him. And in every direction, everywhere he would look, he would see Imam Sadiq alayhi salam.
Yes.
And that reminds us all also of the words of Jesus Christ and some of the Gospels, where he said, turn over a stone and there I am, split open a tree and there I am. So there's this notion that is existing in these traditions and in this book, whereby Al-Hafs Sharif is showing us that the Imam or his soul is encompassing the entire physical creation, the universe, and all where it is, and that the believer who's on this path, he's been asleep, right? As Imam Ali alayhi salam said, the people are asleep, but if they die, they wake up. And before this individual passes from the world, he's able to kind of wake up to a certain degree to where he realizes this truth and he has constant access to the Imam wherever the Imam might be, and he gains a certain level of infallibility. And so he recognizes, he knows his Lord. The final destination was knowing. He came to know his Lord, and he became awakened to these truths, and these gifts were bestowed upon him. Now, the question becomes, okay, well, how wonderful is that? I too would like to be free from the limitations of my physical body. I too want to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and my Imam in the greatest way that I can. And obviously, as we've spoken before, nobody can know God directly. It is an impossibility. You can only know God as much as you know the Imam, alayhi salam, right? Because people learn from something which resembles them, right? So that's where the starting point is that God sends us this guide, and we have to submit to this individual in order that he leads us through these varying degrees. You have this verse in the Holy Quran. It says, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما. And the meaning of this verse is, verily Allah and his angels pray upon the Prophet, right? O you who believe, pray upon him and also submit to him a full submission. And so there's this idea there, this commandment that we have, this importance that's placed upon this act, which is to submit a full submission to who? To Muhammad and the family of Muhammad alayhi salam. Submission is the key. Imam Ahmad al-Hassan alayhi salam, when he was giving the believers an advice on what it is to do, he said that on this path, people have to have patience, and then patience, and then patience, and then submission. In fact, the story in Surah Al-Kahf, which is the one of the righteous servant and Moses, that is a story of submission. Yes. It is a story of a man named Moses who thought in his degree that he was the most knowledgeable. And God wished to teach him that there were still other degrees that were higher than him, that he still hadn't completed. He still hadn't reached the final destination, the final stage. And so he teaches Moses not to look down upon anybody that's beneath him. Hence, he gives him the command, right, to find somebody that he's better than. And he tells him that if you would have brought that dog, I would have wiped your name out of the list of prophets. So a person, no matter what degree you're at, you can't look down at a person who is at a lower degree than you and consider yourself better than them, right? Because you, in the eyes of the person that's at a higher degree, might appear the same. And imagine that. That's a very important concept. Moses, who's an Ulil Azm prophet, he's at this degree. God tells him, bring forward somebody who you're better than. He almost brings a diseased dog. He doesn't in the end bring a diseased dog. God tells him, if you would have brought the diseased dog, I would have wiped your name out. That can only mean that in the eyes of somebody who's at a higher station, perhaps the knowledge that Moses had attained was not any better than that of a diseased dog. And everybody has a master, and he who does not have a master does not have an origin, right? Or is a tree without roots. It's just a tree that's dead, that's lying there. And so the story continues, and it's a story of submission. Moses meets the ascended master, or somebody who's at the next rank or at a rank higher than where he is at. And Moses is required to do one thing, and that is to not object to his teacher. He has to submit to him a thorough submission, a full submission. He has to give him full taslim, right? And as that righteous servant takes him through different experiences. Now, the tests that occur as the righteous servant is trying to move Moses from one station to another, because for sure God is good, and God sends the ascended master or the believer in order that he may help his fellow believer, raise him in degrees. As the righteous servant is attempting to raise Moses in degrees, he's teaching him something. He's teaching him something very important. He's teaching him that there is something called perspectives, that right and wrong, right? Halal and haram, black and white are all in the eye of the beholder. And that it's not quite as, as plain as he thought that they would be. And depending on the eyeglasses that the individual is wearing, and every time you shift from one rank to another, you switch out those eyeglasses and you put a new pair of glasses on where they have new lenses that you're able to see things in a clearer way. He teaches Moses, right, that the killing of the boy, or the making of a hole in the ship, and the building of the wall, that these actions, and whether or not they're acceptable or not, are dependent upon the intention and the knowledge of the individual. Knowledge, and the attainment of this knowledge can cause an individual to become free, right? And to drop or be able to be free from certain restrictions that maybe they had before. Moses had a certain percentage of ignorance, and due to the ignorance that was in him, he was limited in his actions that he could perform, right, against the evil child, or in the situation on the ship, or in the city with the children that had the treasure underneath the wall. But the righteous servant had more knowledge. And the more knowledge that he had, he became free from the limitations that were placed on Moses. And the Sharia, or the jurisprudence itself, changes. Those laws that were given to Moses are not applicable to the individual who's at the station that is higher. And so now we learn something interesting, and that is that the Sharia itself, the jurisprudence, the law of God, changes from an individual to another individual. And I think that this is very clear in this physical world, where we see that, for example, the jurisprudence or the law or the nature that guards the behavior of the animals is much different than the nature and the law and the jurisprudence that guards human beings. And the Sharia, or the jurisprudence of the angels, is also different to the jurisprudence that guards the human beings. And so we can understand, and it becomes clear, that the individuals who reach that final station, where they reach the final goal, They will not be expected to be limited by certain acts of worship such as prayer or fasting or pilgrimage or those things that were given to the people who were at lesser degrees or ranks that came before them. When they have reached that final degree, for them, they would still perhaps have prayer and have pilgrimage and have fasting, but it would take on a different form. They would be fasting from their own ego, right? They would be praying through a different type of act, perhaps their very breaths now, because they see the Imam in every place, and every act that they do by command of God or by command of the Imam. Their egos, their personalities have been completely squashed, and they have united with the light of God in such a way that every breath of theirs becomes an act of worship or an act of prayer, right? And their pilgrimage itself might not be a pilgrimage that it's not required for them to make pilgrimage to, for example, the Kaaba in Mecca or wherever. Rather, their pilgrimage is already complete. It's the true pilgrimage. It's the pilgrimage to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, a pilgrimage to the final destination. So submission is required in order to pass through the degrees. And we find also in al-Haft Sharif this incident that takes place where al-Mufaddal ibn Umar is asked by Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam about a particular verse from the Quran. And the verse from the Quran is where it says, "O you who believe, if you go into a house, then send salams upon yourselves." Right? And he asks al-Mufaddal, what did the people say the meaning of this verse is? And Al-Mufaddal says that they say that if you walk into a home, right, the first thing that you do when you walk in is you say, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. All right? And you find a lot of people in the Middle East or maybe in Iran, they do this. They put the key in the door and they walk in and they say, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. And you ask them, what are you doing? And they say, oh, we're sending salams on the people of the house. And you say, but there's nobody in the house. You just walked in. And they say, oh, well, I think it's the angels that are here in my home. I'm sending salams on them. Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam said, how ignorant are the people and how blind are their hearts. And they didn't understand anything. But rather, the true meaning of the verse is that for every people that reach a specific home, a specific house, a specific rank, a specific degree, right? That they have to, those companions of that degree have to submit a thorough submission, right? Like the first verse where it says, you know, send your prayers and blessings, right? And submit to the Prophet a thorough submission. Here also, the salam, sending salams is to make submission, for you to submit your affairs to your companion who is at the rank that you still have not reached or not gone up to. So the believers have to submit to one another. The ones that are at the lower ranks have to submit to the ones that are at the higher ranks that are above them until the end result is achieved and that believer reaches the higher rank. And so there's this system of submission that exists amongst the believers themselves. And that is also what we see demonstrated so clearly in the story of Moses and the righteous servant. God had required Moses, who reached a very high degree, a degree that all those who were under him, right, the Israelites, had to submit to him. But Moses, right, met a person who's at a higher degree, and he himself had to submit to the righteous servant in order that the righteous servant carry him and make him reach higher degrees. And so the key is in submission and in the recognition of the authority that is placed in the Imam, and recognizing the authority that is placed in the believer who has reached a rank that is higher than me, and submitting to that individual. And so in short, we are wearing these physical bodies, and these physical bodies, they come with a lot of voices. A lot of voices. We have the voices that we are hearing in our day-to-day world that's around us. We hear the voices of our parents. We hear the voices of our spouses. We hear the voices of our children. We hear the voices of our friends. We hear the voices of our bosses. We hear the voices of our coworkers. Each and every voice that we're hearing is affecting us, and it's wanting to pull us in a certain direction, in a certain place. Our teachers, our employers, the governments that are ruling over us, each and every one of them wants to affect us. And we also have the voices of our own selves, the voices of our bellies that tell us when to eat, the voices, right, of our private parts when they're telling us when they want us to act in lust, the voices that are coming from our body as the body is seeking to satisfy itself through worldly pleasures, right, physical things to do or to obtain. And we also have the voices of the shayateen and the jinn that are constantly whispering to us, asking and commanding us to do evil. So each and every one of these voices, whether it's the voices of the body or the external individuals that are in this physical plane around us, or the voices of these demons or evil spirits, it's trying to command us and gain control over us. And it is the duty of the believer who's going on this journey. The only way that he can succeed on the journey is to find one voice that he can hold on to, because he himself is not trained enough to recognize which of these voices has goodness in it if I follow it. He must take a voice as an imam. An individual who's existing at any given time must follow a certain intuition, has to follow a certain voice, a certain command. And depending on the command or the voice that that individual is following, that is his imam. And that's why Imam Rida alayhi salam says about the state of the Muslims in one narration. He says that each and every one of them have gone so astray that they've taken their own selves as their own imam, right? So if you follow your own self, then you've made your own self your imam. So whoever you follow, that is your imam. If you follow a person who's not appointed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then you have made that individual, that tyrant, that false king or leader or ruler as your imam. If you follow a non-working scholar, right, who's not a hujjah, then you've taken that scholar as your imam. If you follow everything that your father or your mother tell you, then you've taken your father or your mother as your imam. If you follow your own desires, right, and lusts, then you've taken your lusts and your desires as your imam. So the individual must find that person who you will take as your imam or your guide, and you follow them. And usually it starts off by following somebody who's higher than you in degree, in knowing of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, another fellow believer who he himself is following somebody who's following the imam. And by following that individual who's following all the commands of the imam, you manage to rise in degree, and your submission to him is ultimately submission to the imam, who is also submitting he himself to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And through this journey of submission, the person comes into a real life situation whereby he is able to conquer and silence all of the other voices. And that is where the great war, the great alchemical change, the great struggle takes place, when the individual fights his own mind and his own heart and his own soul and his own self. And he fights all of the voices that are seeking to influence him. And he manages to silence them in order to follow that voice of the shepherd and to walk with the shepherd silently. Right? And the lamb is a symbol of submission. And that's why Jesus in the Bible is compared to a lamb, because he walks to the slaughter in a state of submission. Right? So, and he's the shepherd, and all of the believers are the sheep, and that's how we must be. We also must be submissive in order at the very end of the road. We are led to the slaughter of the own self, and we are able to become free, and we become in total control of our needs and our desires, because after such a long road of forcing oneself to follow the voice of God instead of the voices that are in our heads and coming from our body, we have completely made tired the physical body. We've applied enough psychological, emotional, and physical pressure on our own selves that now the self, the body, does not even dare ask for us to eat or drink anything. It only desires for us to obey the light of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we succeed and we become free and we take off the chains and we become one with the light of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So today we discussed the basic concept of submission, which is necessary for the believer to rise up through the varying degrees on this journey. And each house that he comes upon, he gains more knowledge. And naturally, as he gains more knowledge in every house, his perspective changes, and the requirements and the expectations of God upon him change, and his actions also change. So the jurisprudence and the law changes for him. And I think mankind as a whole also were kind of going through these evolutionary changes as they shifted from one covenant to another. And the laws changed from in the time of Adam to the time of Noah, and the jurisprudence changed once again in Abraham's time, and then Moses, and then Jesus, and then Muhammad, and finally the Mehdi. The same thing for the believer as he's on this road of closeness towards God. He is changing his perspective and he's becoming more and more free, and the jurisprudence changes, and he's tested in every station and degree in his submission. And usually the tests that have to do with submission, have to do with the jurisprudence. And inshallah, we'll leave things there. And thank you so much for joining me. Ali Rizza, and alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, and sallallahu ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad, al-imma wal mahdiyina wa sallam taslima.
Thank you so much, اباصادق. That was beautiful, and may Allah give you success to truly submit to you and reach that awakening that God wants us to reach. Thank you so much.
God bless you.